Today we're going to be talking about developing a threat model for yourself, also kind of what a threat model is, and tools that might help you with that threat model, or just threat models in general when you need them. So being able to adapt to different situations. Um, so I'd like to start off with a quick story that happened recently that I happen to be paying attention to. There was a recent firebombing at a anti-abortion clinic. Um, Despite your political views, which I'm sure are similar to mine, yeah, I don't. Maybe they deserved it. I don't know. But the person that made these Molotov cocktails, right? They weren't really thinking about their OPSEC, and here's why. So they made these Molotov cocktails and they threw them into this abortion clinic, or anti-abortion clinic rather. So a headquarters of some Christian nationalist kind of anti-abortion place. Um, and they screwed up. So they left their DNA prints on the mason jar that it was used for the Molotov cocktail, right? And they had two of them. One of them didn't ignite, which had his DNA on it. The other one just actually caught fire, but it didn't really do much damage to the actual office, right? There was some damage to some furniture, but he left this note on the wall, right, that I posted here. And it's interesting, right, because you wouldn't think much to it. It's like, okay, well, his message is pretty clear. Um, and so law enforcement got involved, and they're trying to track this guy down. So they sent the DNA prints to a lab, and the prints didn't turn up anywhere in a database. So this is like a new person. It's not doesn't have a criminal history anywhere. A couple months go by, and they discover similar writing during a protest, right? So there was a protest somewhere in the city, um, and somebody tagged a wall with this type of cursive writing here. So the law enforcement decides to look at the footage, and they capture the person who's doing it, and they use the footage to track this person as they go to their car. Well, we assume their car, right? So they're able to get the license plate just from the footage of this person who made this similar looking tag, and they found the registered owner of that car, right? So there's not much they can do at this point, but besides they have what might be a suspect, right? They don't have enough evidence, but they put out a memo to like look for this truck in the wild, right? Well, a cop finds the truck, and they just watch it. They don't interact in it with the person. And this person decides to go to a restaurant and order some food, and he throws his garbage out. The cop goes to the garbage and finds a half-eaten burrito from that person. He sends the half-eaten burrito to the lab, and guess what? The DNA matches the DNA that was on the fingerprint from the mason jar, right? Um, and so they look into this person, and they see that he's booked a one-way trip to Guatemala, which should raise a lot of red flags as well. So they intercept this guy, and they tie him back to the same person that had, firebombed the anti-abortion clinic, or anti-abortion headquarters, I should say. So what does this mean? What's the story about? Well, one man's trash is another man's treasure, in a sense, and we all leave a trail of breadcrumbs, sometimes literally, that lead back to us. So what does that mean about a threat model? Well, when you're thinking about a threat model, you have to ask particular questions about how you're going to mitigate the threat, but also what do you want to protect, right? So in this case, this guy should have protected his identity, and he failed not just as his DNA, but really the penmanship, which you wouldn't think about at all, right? How you write, but even how you write is sometimes unique to you, unique enough to you. Um, so even your behavior can identify who you are. So if we go to some random tools here, like what could have this person used to help hide his identity? Nothing really, right? There's nothing he could have done. There's no security tool he could have used to enhance his privacy because he made operational security failures, right? Just with his behavior. Um, and we're talking about pen and paper, the earliest tool we know. He wasn't able to keep that secure or even think about that. So we'll get back to this picture a little bit later about privacy tools and how that might help or hinder our threat model. But let's get into just how we look at the adversaries for a threat model, right? So in the earlier example, we looked at probably just local law enforcement at this point, right? And we tend to define our adversaries with the adjective skilled and motivated, right? They're unskilled, they're unmotivated, they're unskilled and motivated. Maybe they're skilled but not necessarily motivated. And we kind of apply these to a general broad range of threat actors or threat adversaries, rather. So an unskilled, unmotivated person might be an ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend or ex-partner, right? That are maybe just like overly curious about what you're doing or where you're at. We can get into this, and this will kind of be the basis for a threat model we'll build. You might have unskilled and motivated. These are advertisers, so people that are tracking you across online shopping stores, or maybe HR people that are checking your background. So, if you did keg stand and post that on TikTok, maybe they'll find that if your settings aren't good enough. Um, if you look at skilled and unmotivated, maybe it's an ISP, an internet service provider. They could look into you, but you're not doing really anything of interest yet. And it says you don't matter, but really, I guess your activity doesn't really matter to them because it's not, raising any red flags at the moment. Although we'll see later, Tor browser that the ISP will know if you use Tor. But again, it's kind of like they're not necessarily motivated because it's like, all right, whatever. Um, and then you get into the skilled and motivated, which are your law enforcement, OSINT researchers, open source intelligence, that stands for, as I'm sure you've found out in this group at all. Trolls, ironically enough, can apply to this group. Think of trolls as people that go on Twitch and watch streamers and then swat them. They call a bomb threat in at their house and they come in. So these are people that are skilled and motivated, but maybe don't have a lot of resources to them. They just maybe have time. So this guide applies to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the online anonymity. So I can link that in general at some point in the voice chat. I downloaded it. It's actually accessible on its own website, but sometimes it's good to download just to have it. It's updated pretty consistently with a changelog. There's another part of this that we're missing here, and that deals with unlimited global resources people. So the NSA, FSB, MSS, Mossad. Mossad is the Israeli spy agency, basically. And I put a quote from James Mickens here, who's a famous computer scientist who worked from Harvard, and I think he works at Microsoft now. Basically, you're either dealing with Mossad or not Mossad. If you're dealing with Mossad, you don't have a chance in hell with whatever threat model you have, right? Not Mossad, so anything below this, which goes back to here, anything that's not Mossad, you have a pretty good chance of, if you follow some of the good threat model rules and build a good threat model for yourself, you have a pretty good chance of staying anonymous or not being identified. Again, if it's Mossad you're dealing with, maybe one, maybe you deserve to be on that list, and two, they will find you over time no matter what you take. The guide specifically mentions that the length of the book would have to be twice the size in order to incorporate all the things you might have to do to avoid being caught by NSA or Mossad or any of those secret services. So what are the questions you ask when you're building a threat model? First, what do you want to protect? Is it your identity? Is it your data? Is it your location? Is it a particular person? Is it a piece of software? Is it a piece of information you're trying to protect? Information could be something you're blowing the whistle about with respect to an organization or an institution. Who do you interact with currently, right? And that's kind of deals with like if you're trying to protect something, are you trying to protect it from somebody that you currently interact with, or do the people you interact with are people you can trust? So it could be friends and family, it could be colleagues, it could be law enforcement already. You never know. There's a lot of different answers to that question. What systems do you use, and where is that data? So systems are not necessarily software-based, right? Some systems can be infrastructure-based, like maybe you use a transportation system and there's CCTV footage of you taking the train, right? That is incorporated into your threat model, where you take the bus or infrastructure kind of in general. It applies to software and to physical world as well. Do these things interact with each other? Often the answer to this question is always going to be yes, because at this point, most things interact with each other just by nature of being connected to the internet. There are instances when they don't. Maybe your friends don't interact with the same group of people you might be worried about in terms of threats. But there are use cases for both. Rules. What rules do you want to establish for yourself when you're trying to protect something, right? Uh, do you want only certain people to know your location? Do you want only certain people to know your identity? Or do you want no one to know your identity? Do you want to remain anonymous 100% of the time, some of the time, all the time? Um, what are your top threats? What threaten not only what you want to protect, but what threatens the rules? So what can break your rules here that you establish? So those questions will help you. All of those questions will help you identify how to mitigate those threats. So answering these questions will point you kind of to what you need to use, whether it's software, whether it's a behavioral change, whether it's where you actually are located when you are trying to follow your own rules. Um, so that's the basis of it. Threat model typically deals with software, like the original application deals with threat modeling, is dealt with software development. So when we think of threat models for software, we typically think of how our features are going to be integrated and what potential leaks might occur or what injections you can potentially do with software. Basically how it can be utilized to do something it wasn't intended to do. So a threat model with yourself is just, going through your basic motions of what you do and trying to understand your patterns, um, and how to mitigate patterns that potentially leak information about what you want to protect. So that's the gist of it. Um, let's take a scenario where we're going to build a threat model around avoiding an ex-partner, right? This is really kind of a silly example, kind of just a proof of concept to get us started with answering some of these questions. Then we'll realize that it gets harder. It gets harder even with something basic like this. So we're avoiding one person. Imagine avoiding a corporation, or or even law enforcement, right? Suddenly you're protecting yourself against a whole bunch of people and departments. Um, but what do you want to protect? Well, if you're avoiding somebody, right, like a physical, you want to protect your location, right? You want to avoid bumping into this person. Again, maybe it's just an overly curious partner who just wants to see what you're doing, and maybe you're trying to date other people. Maybe you're trying to just move on, and they're not ready to move on yet. So you want to protect your location to avoid any awkward interactions, right? Uh, who do you interact with? Do you have a shared friend group, right? Like you're in college, so uh, do you have the same classes? Are you in the same work, or the same study? That influences, uh, how your location is established even within your friend group. Um, what systems do you use and where is that data? So we're just going to look at social media mostly. Gmail is kind of just added for a later example. So, all of us use social media to some extent. Some of those systems give more information than we realize, and that information can be gleaned rather easily. And do these things interact with each other? Well, yeah. Let's say that we're all following each other on Instagram and Snapchat, including the ex-partner, and maybe you unfriended them, or maybe you unfollowed them, or whatever. And maybe your profile is such that they can still see your activity. So, what rules do you want to establish to protect your location from this person? Well, you only want certain friends to know where you are and what you're doing at any given time, right? You don't want to totally get rid of your social life, right? You don't want to be a hermit with an aluminum hat on. So what can you do to maintain kind of the systems that you use, protect your data, and avoid always giving up your location? Um, and maybe the time frame for this threat model is pretty short. Maybe it's only a couple weeks or maybe a month of doing this, and maybe modifying some behaviors. We've all done this maybe just intuitively, but I'm going to show you a little bit of some of the breakdown of like where things could be missing. So how do we mitigate the top threat, which is the leak of our information? What do we do about it? There's a number of things, right? Snapchat has ghost mode, which I'm sure some of you have already maybe used, just by nature of being cybersecurity. It basically hides your location, or it just doesn't even include your location in any of your posts. Um, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but based on what I read, it seems like a pretty good option. It's not the end-all be-all though, and I'll get into that, and that's kind of what leads into the OSINT a little bit here. There's also removing your locations from Instagram. Like you can remove, if you take a picture of a dog, right? But, they don't know what that dog is, but maybe you include the park that you saw that at. Well, they know in real time where you're at. So removing locations is pretty important. Setting your profile to private is helpful, so that, obviously if you've unfollowed them and you set it to private, they can't see anything unless they look on a friend's phone. Um, so you can kind of establish that use case as you go. And the other important thing here for Instagram, at least, and it might apply to some of the other ones, but this is where I saw the most interesting, removing third-party app access. So if there's a third party that Instagram is integrated with that shares data, maybe it's you're authenticating with Instagram or Facebook or Meta, um, third-party app access doesn't always catch up with when you set your profile settings. So it takes a number of days for it to actually catch up and realize that it has non-public information, and it has to take it down. So, there might be a delay as to when you might have things uploaded with whatever services you've integrated with Instagram. So there is a way to remove that, and you just go into Instagram's privacy settings to do that. Um, so another interesting thing to do, this depends on the length of your relationship, let's say, change your passwords and pins. Why? Maybe not necessarily your pins to like your credit card or your debit card, but anything that applies and uses information that is easily guessable. If a person knows you well enough, they probably know your birthday, or they should, or well, maybe that's why they're an ex-partner if they didn't. Home street names, pet names, graduation dates. Um, why is it important to do that? Well, if you had ever signed in on their phone or their computer using your account, it's possible that the browser has stored that information in its local storage, right? Uh, and we're talking at this point maybe unmotivated but somewhat skilled. Maybe they're slightly motivated and they're like, oh, I could, see if they're still logged in, go on your computer. Maybe they use Google Chrome and you accidentally press save your credentials so they can automatically see your Facebook page or something, or you can see their email. Um, so it's important to do that just so that you avoid that type of information leakage. Um, and I also recommend using two-factor. Again, another kind of defense in depth measure there. An encrypted password storage is helpful. Again, trying to avoid using easily guessable names and streets and everything like that could apply to you. Um, I'll give you an example. I did an external pen test several weeks ago, a month ago, I think, and I used a simple password like winter 2022 exclamation point, and I was able to get into 3 email accounts of a client that I was pen testing. And then they didn't use 2FA for like a major company. So it's more common than you think. So it's good to do that. Avoid shared public spaces for some time. You might incidentally do this anyway, right? It's like if you know this person walks down this hallway, you're gonna probably pick a different hallway just so you don't see them, until things boil over. But this can get a little tricky, right? If you're in the same class or if you're at the same work, it's gonna be tough. Ideally, you don't date people at work, but avoid anything that might establish what is your current pattern. If you have work every Saturday and you go to the same burger shop afterwards, well, if they know you well enough, they probably know that you might be there, and they'll go there. So this is kind of a behavior modification. It's as a mitigation, right? Not necessarily software based. Use a phone application that doesn't store location metadata when you're taking pictures. We'll get into this a little bit, but essentially, particularly with the iPhone that I noticed, but Android as well, we store a lot of information about the location of the picture when it was taken. Now, if you're using Instagram, Snapchat solely, it's not a big deal because you're uploading the picture to their content delivery networks, and the metadata has probably been scrubbed, or it's hard to even re-download again. I'm sure there's instances where you could actually exfiltrate the metadata, but it's hard. That requires some skill. So if you're dealing with an unskilled adversary, they're not going to go to that trouble at that point. But let's talk a little bit about the metadata and what it looks like. So unskilled and motivated, that type of person might search for a picture and upload that picture to a website that actually translate that XF data into a readable format. If you're somewhat skilled, I mean, like, if you used GIMP before and you're somewhat motivated, well, you just put a photo into GIMP and it spits out all the EXIF information. So this is a picture of my sibling's dog, right? It tells me the exact longitude, latitude, even altitude, and gives me the timestamp when it was taken, tells me what it was used to take the picture with, and also gives you normal information like about the camera, like the f-stop, the ISO that was used, and that's all has other purposes for photo taking. But you can actually plug in those GPS coordinates and find the exact address where it was taken, and I can tell you that this was actually the address. So we know exactly where this person is. Um, so if somebody's skilled enough, maybe they are able to get a picture of you recently that was taken within a day or a couple of hours. They could plug this in and see where you are. So you suddenly this model here, which seemed pretty simple to begin with, just kind of for mitigation wise, like just changing some settings, suddenly it becomes you know more difficult. Like, oh wait, like now we have to understand that the technology can actually, although it can help us, right, it can hurt us at the same time. So just kind of another reminder that privacy was built in after the fact for a lot of these applications. Privacy is built in, or it wasn't built in at all. So what about your friends and family? So let's say you send a picture to a friend, and that friend happens to show your ex-partner this picture, and like, oh, can you send that to me? It looks really cute, that dog. Suddenly, your friend just leaked a bunch of information about you without realizing it, because who knows this stuff? Not many. Not many people know this stuff, or even know where to look for it. So you have to explain to people, if you're establishing a threat model and you interact with them on a regular basis, you have to explain your threat model to them and why it's important. And if they can't follow what you're giving them, they can't trust them to some extent, you have to apply similar rules to them too, which isn't fun. Especially if it's just for a short time frame. It seems like you're kind of ghosting everybody a little bit. Um, but that's how far you have to go in order to protect something like location. So it gets trickier. So I have a link here. This knitter is actually Twitter, but it's a privacy-focused version of Twitter. This was posted from another Discord server I belong to. But this picture, taken out of context, shows just an island off in Google Earth, and it's actually correlated with an actual picture of an island. Um, this is footage taken from the drone that was shot down over close to Russia. I say close to Russia because the Russians claim that this U.S. drone violated their airspace and it actually went to their territory. The U.S. claimed that no, we were actually in the international economic zone. We were well within our right to be there. We were just monitoring. And so there was a lot of back and forth as like who was right. So, well, a person, this geoconfirmed account, actually went through the footage and was able to map exactly where this drone was when it wasn't shot down. It was just disabled with they sprayed gas, they sprayed fuel on it essentially, and that just disabled it. And they hit the propeller on the drone, and which caused it to crash. Um, so they were able to tell from the footage the direction the drone was heading, the light that was hitting it, and like where the sun was at that time. So they were able to get kind of a horizon differential. So that works by you're able to tell if there's sunlight at a certain particular time, you can tell what zone of like the hemisphere you're in. So it's pretty interesting. It deals with like kind of maritime maps and things like that. But this particular picture is interesting because you see this mountain here, and they were able to correlate even the peaks and valleys of this mountain with an actual image from Google Earth. And based on the nautical distance from this island to the Russian territory, they were able to establish that no, we were actually in international waters at that time. So the Russians, in fact, were out of their space at that point. Uh, so it's interesting. So our backgrounds, the things we kind of don't think about, can actually give a lot of information about our location. I mean, we're talking about extremely blurry picture of just a couple peaks and valleys, but it gives us enough to go off of to be like, oh no, the location's exactly here, or pretty close approximately to here. So suddenly your location changes, right? Your location changes how you act, right? If you're trying to avoid a person and you're in a bar, right? If it's the only bar in town, well, it's going to be pretty easily identifiable, even if you try to crop out as much as you can. Uh, based on maybe even the wood paneling, right? Or maybe the some of the pictures that are on the wall, things like that. And that could be correlated with maybe public information images on a search engine that the bar might have put up at some point. Um, so the threat model becomes trickier, and you have to determine, again, back to the adversary. You have to determine, are they unskilled and unmotivated? Like maybe just changing your privacy settings is enough, right? Maybe you're just dealing with a person who's just kind of clingy, and maybe they didn't want to break up, but like they don't have enough wherewithal to like go through all of the, like downloading the EXIF data off of the image, right? But what if you're dealing with somebody who's unskilled and motivated? I think this is where things get dangerous. So maybe you're dealing with a jealous ex, and maybe it's one of those types where, if I can't have you, nobody else can have you. And these people are scary because they can be highly motivated and they can become skilled. Um, so, this happens often, more often than we'd like, which is where you have to consider operation security, you know, as an adaptation, right? You're always adapting to your current model. You're always adapting your model to new threats or to new developments. So just note that they're just some starting points, right? You got the questions to help establish what a threat model would look like. Um, and you might need more work to capture more details. There's a lot to consider with each potential scenario. Um, so just a note on privacy, right? So we were trying to hide our location. Like we were trying to keep that private to some extent. So in that regard, what is the difference between anonymity and confidentiality, right? Anonymity means people know your actions, right? But they don't necessarily know who you are. It's an important point because confidentiality is almost the opposite. Confidentiality is people know who you are, but they don't know what you're doing, right? So essentially, hiding your location is more confidentiality as opposed to anonymity, which maybe is obvious, but it's important to note the difference because that establishes the types of tools that you might use going forward. I just put the definition of OPSEC here from NIST. So we have just a process by which adversaries can identify, control, protect unclassified evidence. And we went through some of the steps within the threat model. So identify critical information. So in our case, that'd be location, the analysis of threats, the software we use and what it tells about us, analysis of vulnerability. So we looked at what each kind of threat does and what we can do about it, the assessment of the risk, and application of countermeasures. Again, so some of the tools we might use, some of the behavior change we might make for a threat model. So I brought this up at the beginning. A lot of different tools here. I'm sure you've seen all of them. You'll note that some of them aren't tools. You just have a random bus here and a random person here, a random person here. So why would I include these as part of your threat model or part of privacy tools, really? Well, one reason is there's technology that exists now to establish literally how you walk, to determine the pattern by which you walk and to correlate it with your identity, right? So even if you take all of the measures and you're trying to hide your identity, even how you walk, your gait or your cadence can tell a lot about you. And that could be generated with AI, or it could be used with facial technology. So if you even covered your face with these special glasses here to help mitigate the facial recognition software that might be used in footage in real time, they could still analyze your gait. So there's a lot of weird things that are not tools, but you should think of them as tools in a way. So maybe a tool is like inserting a heel insert so that your gait is changed slightly or enough that it doesn't trigger an AI detection tool. Maybe you take public transportation more often to avoid having anything registered to your name, right? There's cameras on the bus, but you can avoid some of that just by nature of being more anonymous, right? Somewhat anonymous, just by being around other people, kind of hiding in plain sight, if you will. So let's look at some of these tools here and just get a sense of what privacy they might be able to provide us or where they lack, really. So it's weird to think of browsers as tools, but they are tools, right? They are software tools, and they include a lot of information about our computers and what we do with them and what we look for on the internet. We have Firefox, we have Brave, we have Chrome, and again, Chrome is it comes from Google, so there's a lot of Chromium-based browsers, Brave being one of them, and Tor, of course, which I think is Mozilla-based as well. Or in addition to that, uh, Brave has come up as a very popular option because it blocks a lot of things by default. So it kind of has privacy built in, which is nice. Uh, Firefox is a favorite of mine at least. It has some shortcomings, uh, but the market share is pretty low for it too. I mean, comparatively, Chrome has the largest market share for people. I mean, just like regular Chrome, not even ungoogled Chrome. Um, so I included a reference here to github.com, ArcandFox. There's configurations you can use to help limit the amount of fingerprinting, the amount of cross-site cookies that are sent across to other websites. Um, so what does that mean, right? Um, Applications, I mean, particularly internet applications that you might visit, they do something called fingerprinting, right? Fingerprinting is when they're trying to establish what browser you're using and what OS you're using, and maybe some other metadata that your browser kind of gives freely just by nature of the software that's included within Firefox or Chrome. And it actually has a decent purpose for the most part, or it should. I think the intention was there, but if you're running Linux and you're using Firefox and you try to watch YouTube video, how that YouTube video is displayed to you, how the audio is transferred, might be different than how it's done on Windows 10 or Windows 11 even. So fingerprinting helps the service kind of best kind of dynamically update itself so that it can show you the video without any issues, right? If you were to switch your user agent in Mozilla to Windows when you're running Linux and you try to watch a video, the audio will be all screwed up. It's a very weird thing that occurs. And that it uses that user agent to help fix basically its audio codec to adjust itself so it could play normally like it would on any other OS. Um, Fingerprinting, however, has this other kind of nefarious um, use case where we can learn more and more about you based on how you use the browser and what sites you visit. There are things called beacons. There are pixels that can be used to track you across the internet. And all of these ways are used to kind of establish basically like ad tracking to build a profile out of you. So depending on the sites you visit, you might have some beacons that are used to stay in your local storage, and as you visit other websites, that beacon kind of transmits those places back to whatever the ad firm service is, and they build a profile of you. They sell that profile to other ad firms that learn how to advertise to you better. So it's a bit of an invasion of privacy. And there are tools to help with that. So on the right, I included, you can try to block fingerprinters, crypto miners tracking content, cookies. It often breaks a lot of websites because the websites we visit now really rely on that data to just function, which sucks. And you can use extensions to help deal with fingerprinting that is done in a way that it's not privacy focused, right? One of my favorites is NoScript. NoScript essentially blocks all outgoing JavaScript or any incoming JavaScript. So, let's say they have a content security policy, and one of their script sources is like Qualtrics.com. Qualtrics is, another kind of ad and data bank that stores information about your browser session and like builds a profile off you. You can block that domain from loading in, so it actually won't transmit any data. It won't even allow the script to load when the page is visited. It has to be configured for each individual page and each individual domain, which can get really tricky. But it allows you to do things like if you load in Twitch, right? You allow Twitch and you allow Twitch CDN for the videos to actually stream, but you can disallow like Amazon ad system, right? It doesn't always protect against ads, but it protects your user interface. So like it makes it so the user interface is a little bit nicer. You don't have ads constantly streaming across. So it's helpful. It's not a panacea, right? Blocking JavaScript alone is not going to necessarily change anything. There's other methods from HTML and CSS that they can pick up, or just from what your browser transmits as it's functioning. One note about extensions, uh, you actually fingerprint yourself by trying to resist fingerprinting, which is kind of ironic. Because there's such a small use case of people that actually seem to care about this. Um, the more you add extensions to block ads, to block domains, to block scripts from running, the more you make yourself out to be like, oh, you're the guy that blocks everything. I know who you are. And so you ironically make a profile of yourself out of like what you try to resist. So there's that kind of a happy medium as to what you block and what you don't block. Not to mean that it's not useful, but it happens. Here's just a table, again, from the guide that I mentioned earlier. It talks about what fingerprinting tests actually work. You can test this in real time with Cover Your Tracks from EFF, the Electronic Frontier organization. You can see that Brave passes all the tests, and essentially they enable JavaScript so that, obviously they can see like what a normal use case would look like, but everything else pretty much fails. So again, Brave kind of gets accolades for doing pretty well just by default with no updates, no server setting changes or anything like that. Here's an example of scripts in action. There is no script in action, right? So here's qualtrics.com. With no script, you can actually click on a domain and you can use something called the markup. So when you click on it, it looks like there's a directory. If you click on the markup or if you click on a couple of other ones, McAfee is another ironic one. It can tell you kind of the rating, privacy rating of it, and this particular tells you whether or not there's ad trackers, whether there's third-party cookies that are found on it, whether they're monitoring keystrokes, whether they're telling Facebook that you went there or telling Google Analytics. So it's really useful if you're just trying to maintain some level of privacy. You'll just to kind of give you a little bit of background. So the website could be monitoring keystrokes and mouse clicks. Uh, by nature of using JavaScript, that happens a lot. If you can envision using a search form like this, right? But as you're typing, the results automatically pop up. I mean, that's just JavaScript, right? That's just a DOM-based sync and source. That's like an example of something that might be vulnerable to DOM-based cross-site scripting. But essentially, it's updating in real time so that the server doesn't have to reload the page every time you search for something, right? So that might not necessarily be a problem, but obviously it found that it was capturing user keystrokes. So even if you didn't send something for a search, it already captured it anyway. So that could be potentially malicious, or in this case, it's just an ad firm being overly intrusive. So let's talk browsers a little bit. We have Tor and Brave, right? Tor, Brave, the private tab here. Why do I bring up Brave private tab? Well, you can enable Brave, the private tab of Brave, to actually go through Tor. And that has actually been considered better functionality overall. But if you're worried about anonymity over functionality, you should stick with the Tor browser. And it just deals with configurations on your computer and how it connects to the SOCKS proxy. But Tor, we're dealing with onion routing, right? We're dealing with connecting to a bunch of different nodes that help hide our original IP. And essentially, Tor uses the SOCKS configuration to connect. I forget what port. I think it's 9050 or something. Your ISPs can know when you're using Tor, but it goes back to that threat adversary skill level. They're skilled, but they're not really motivated. Just because you're using Tor doesn't necessarily mean anything. They're not like reporting it to anybody, or they're not even like looking into it. They're able to see in their logs that you connect to the Tor at some point. So it's worth knowing. There's something you can do called bridging and snowflake bridging, which it basically enables other users from other countries that might be in hostile authoritarian governments to access nodes kind of through your client. So you're making yourself available as not really a node, but a bridge to a node. So basically how that works is like you might visit a website normally, but someone is actually able to use your connection to a website to connect to an actual node through Tor. So it's really cool. It's actually pretty safe to use. Obviously do some research on that for yourself, but it's a cool thing, and it helps people connect to Tor safely as well. You can do VPN over Tor, and why is that useful? That might be useful if you need to authenticate to services, right? if you need to authenticate to something, some service you're using on Tor, and you want to remain anonymous. Uh, and why do I say anonymous as opposed to confidential? Well, if you're using a VPN, you are likely no longer anonymous, right? If you pay for a VPN, you might be using financial information that belongs to you. So you have to be careful about that. Tor's kind of built-in stream isolation is useful when there's no authentication needed. Like you just want to browse essentially. You don't need to authenticate anywhere. Here's an example of VPN over Tor, this configuration. This includes Unix as well, which we can kind of get into later. But essentially all you have to know is that we have this Tor network that's encrypted. We're going from, let's say, a virtual machine on our host OS, and we're connected to some internet service, but we're actually, once we connect to Tor, we're actually connected to another VPN through Tor. So if somebody were to, an adversary were to if let's say our VPN dropped for some reason, we're still behind this Tor network, so they can only really see the exit node from which our traffic was originating. And just to explain Tor a little bit more, when we connect to Tor, we're connected to our first node. That first node, and we're just talking about like a computer basically somewhere. Um, that first node knows our actual IP address. And what it does is that it tries to stream our packets through TCP to other nodes, and it has a particular way of doing it. It's kind of a chain of nodes, such that to the point when it gets to the last node, the data is very hard to trace back to us. The only way it can be traced back to us is through time correlation. So if you happen to visit the same Onion service all the time, every day, and you happen to connect to Tor every time, all the time, every day, at the same time, that can be correlated back to you. And there's other ways. I mean, just to kind of get ahead of ourselves. The exit nodes, there's dirty nodes, there's clean nodes, and then there's ones run by the FBI. So you have to be careful about what nodes you trust. And there might be information about that. A lot of like mainstream internet services. So if you're not connected to an Onion service, you're connected to just regular clear text web. Um, a lot of services block nodes, and that's considered dirty. They're on the block list. If you connect to a clean one, maybe they're not blocked just yet. Um, so when's a good time to use Tor? When would you actually want to use this? I mean, I guess if you just need the anonymity to browse around, maybe you're just interested in what the hell's on the dark web. You can use Tor. Or really, if you're just browsing, use the Brave option, a private tab through Tor, right? Uh, it depends on what your use case is, of course. The best time to use it is when there's online censorship in a hostile environment. So in the US, I mean, I think we're not as applicable here, depending on your situation. But this is really intended for like journalists that might be operating in an authoritarian government, and they need to get information out to maybe a more international news service. They're trying to get help for the population. They'll use Tor to anonymize themselves, right? It's a pretty useful tool for that. Now, just to note, of course, you've heard there's probably a lot of illegal services and goods that are operating on Onion services, hence the dark web. Really, the intention was to allow communication to the outside world from controlled societies, right? So China, North Korea, like those places, even parts of the Middle East, right, where things are heavily restricted. Tor is a good option if you can even download it, even if you can get access to it, which is not always the case. Just to give you an idea, Tor, it has bad uses and has good uses, much like nuclear energy, right? Nuclear energy is somewhat a clean energy type, right? But it also is on the side note, it's used for making nuclear bombs, right? Where the same process goes into nuclear bomb building and maintaining. So there's good intentions and bad intentions with every technology. So I try to give that a little bit more of a not so much bias. That there's uses for it and there isn't. And if you're trying to stay anonymous, it's a good tool. VPNs. VPNs are basically just another ISP that know your origin IP. So the origin IP is the public IP that's associated with whatever account you have. So Maybe you're with Comcast, maybe you're with Spectrum or Cox or one of those guys, which is not many. And VPNs just, provide you internet uh, access through their computers. So you're kind of directly connecting to their servers, and you have a dedicated IP that belongs to the VPN as opposed to your ISP. There's a famous claim, or infamous, which is the no logs for VPNs. I can tell you that's bullshit. Um, there's logs everywhere, and maybe the most basic log is just a timestamp and like your originating IP. But most of the case, there's some form of logs because they have to be able to debug and troubleshoot their servers when things come up and things happen. Maybe configurations change, maybe they update their protocols. So they need to be able to see what's going on. So, it's useful to know that if they say no logs, you can pretty much say it's probably bullshit. And we can get into how you get around that. Some news, the Restrict Act is kind of in the works in the US, and the intention of the Restrict Act is to make it so that basically TikTok gets outlawed, banned, like so that but it deals with software that maybe a foreign adversary might use as kind of a pretext to get data out of the country they're targeting. Problem is that it's overly broad, as a lot of bills often are, and there's potential extension to VPNs and their end users. So, maybe you're using a VPN to connect to a service, in a country that currently has, a beef with the US or something. And if you're using a VPN to connect there, you could potentially be implicated in this act if it's against the rules. Uh, so there's weird things going on with VPNs. Uh, and the other thing about VPNs is they typically know who you are based on how you pay for it, right? If you use a credit card or use bank account information, I mean, it's definitely tied to you. Hence, confidential, right? It's confidential. They're trying to keep it confidential so long as you don't break the terms of service for them. Uh, if they get a loss, arrest warrant, not arrest warrant, they get a warrant for information about you, they're probably going to hand it over. These companies cost a lot of servers cost a lot of money over time, and they have no real use case to like just ruin their business. There's only been one use case where someone actually just deleted their business so that they didn't have to actually give in to a search warrant. Um, so your financial information can tie you back to what you're doing. The ISP will know that you're connecting to a VPN, right? So the moment you make that first initial connection saying, hey, I want to connect to this IP, that's the first and last thing the ISP will know. So they don't know what you're doing because the traffic is being tunneled. So maybe they're using WireGuard or whatever protocol is being utilized for the VPN. But essentially, that's what the ISPs knows. So again, skilled, unmotivated. Know you're connecting a VPN, but they can't do anything about it. What is the use case for VPNs? Well, you can stream shows from other countries to bypass copyright restrictions. Yeah, maybe not Netflix anymore, but still some other streaming services. But really, anything considered illegal in your country, I mean, just forget it. If there's a will to understand what you're doing on a VPN, suddenly the logs are going to appear, and it might not necessarily be traffic, but it could be just where you connected from, and that is enough information to get off you because maybe your browser storage isn't configured quite correctly and like you have all of your sites still listed on your browser storage. So worth understanding that VPNs don't necessarily protect you from anything. You're just choosing who knows your traffic essentially. Uh, oops, yeah, VPN, cache and crypto. You can pay with VPNs, pay for VPNs using cache. Mullvad is a typical example. I think even Proton VPN takes cache. And essentially, they give you a random generated number. When they receive your cache payment, you can use that random generated number in their client, and it'll work. So they really know nothing about you at all. Maybe a timestamp. That's about it, and maybe your originating IP. But again, they can't really correlate it with anything. They just have an originating IP. So if you go to a Starbucks in New York City, you connect to a Mullvad VPN, you leave. I mean, they have the trails lost, right? So Mullvad's very good. They also accept crypto. Monero is a popular choice. Um, it has its own failings when it comes to privacy. You might hear the acronym KYC, Know Your Customer. Um, Bitcoin is kind of an example of it. It's very hard to hide transactions anymore that aren't tied to your identity with Bitcoin. There is examples of it. There's a great talk for Darknet Diaries about how North Korea uses Bitcoin, how they basically launder their money through Bitcoin. So worth checking out that episode, or those couple episodes rather. But it is an option. So the crypto is accepted by VPN, so it could work as long as you're smart about the crypto access. The other option for VPNs is to establish a VPS, which is essentially a virtual private server that you spun up, and it operates the same way as a VPN. So it can be cheaper, especially if you're just doing it for a short while. It helps defeat some VPN IP block lists. So if you happen to access a website using a default, cookie cutter VPN, you might get a message from Cloudflare saying, "Oh, this IP address has been restricted from abuse" or something like that. So having your own virtual private server is really useful in that regard because it looks like just another IP from another computer server. Um, you can also do SOCKS proxy through localhost using your virtual private server, which very basically it just means you're SSHing into a server and you're using SOCKS proxy for localhost to tunnel all of your traffic to that server, and then actually use the server to you know be the what is the originating point of your traffic as opposed to your own home computer. Let's get into messaging apps a little bit, and there's only a couple more slides, so I don't want to go too far over it. So almost done. Messaging apps. So when we're talking about privacy, Discord is not a good example of privacy. There's no end-to-end encryption. It's closed source code that is supposed to open source. There's no metadata protection, so information about the message that's being sent. And there's no encryption at rest, those types of other features that are important in privacy. Uh, arguably, it seems to validate whether or not requests for information or even like search warrants are lawful. Um, they leave room for good faith instances where immediate harm can be done. So essentially, like, here's all the data, officer. Um, so they're pretty transparent about it, and Microsoft is similar, right? A lot of these major tech firms that collect telemetry, say all these things. Um, and in our use case, it's not a bad thing. I mean, there's a lot of like really dirty, disgusting stuff that is on Discord, so maybe it's not all bad. But it's really not good for privacy, not good for anonymity, not good for confidentiality. But are there any alternatives? Element through matrix.org, so Matrix being kind of the framework there. Element's pretty good. Very similar voice over internet protocol. Like it's close. It's close, but it's not going to be Discord. What's nice about it is there's a good variety of clients to choose from. When I say client, I mean, a way of connecting to Element or the way of connecting to a server using Element. For any people that uses Rust, Fractal is a really good one for a client to connect to Element. They just have poor metadata protection, which you can mitigate on your own. So you can actually virtualize the software, containerize the software, um, and it's only partially decentralized as opposed to like a federated network of individual servers. So that means they probably use some cloud services essentially. Um, the other alternative is just good old Internet Relay Chat (IRC). So if you ever heard of Hex Chat, that's like an early one that it's still somewhat supported. But there's a lot of different IRC clients that are still there. I think Pigeon is still around, um, but not a great alternative. It's really just for text-based. I mean, you might have heard Anonymous uses IRC kind of exclusively. That has really easy configurations to make it more secure and make it encrypted. Um, but in other words, the alternatives to Discord and maybe Slack or Teams, they're not great. They're not that great. Um, but when it comes to the phone, at least mobile applications, there's a lot of good alternatives, I think. Um, so Briar is an example of one. Briar has come up recently because it's been used in the Ukraine conflict, or the conflict in Ukraine, I guess. What's cool about it is you don't necessarily need internet to send messages. You can actually use just Wi-Fi access points, like with your phone, like your phone acting as a Wi-Fi access point, and you can use Bluetooth as well to transmit messages to people that are nearby. And then, if it connects to the internet, it can update with other messages that were missed. And it also works over Tor. So if you want to use it over the Onion routing, you can do that. Um, if you're less concerned about anonymity, Signal's a good option. Signal requires a phone number. So if you're concerned about anonymity, you'd have to get a burner phone and you'd have to make sure that the SIM card doesn't include any verification. So like whether it's ID verification, whether it's um, any sort of like location or email verification, that kind of thing. You want it to be not tied to you. So you'd have to like pay in cash to get a burner phone, and then only use that burner phone, outside of your house, outside of the locations where you're often near. But if you like Signal just for the confidentiality aspect of it, then you can just use it on your regular phone. Um, it has encryption kind of built in, encryption at rest, and encryption end to end. It has perfect forward secrecy, so when it initially makes contact with somebody else, that's encrypted as well. Obviously, I mentioned Briar's on mobile. Session's another one. Not to get too far into that, but Session, it's a little opaque as to how that's funded, and the nodes cost a lot to run. It's Australian based, so they don't have great privacy laws, much like the US. So it's kind of a last resort, but it works pretty well. Molly is a fork of Signal for Android. They mention the use of proprietary code, but they have a free and open source version, and they also have support for Tor. So why would you want to use messaging apps? If you're connecting with somebody that's part of your threat model and you don't want anything tied back to you, but you want to be able to connect or talk to them or to exchange information, these are some alternatives you can use. The other one I didn't mention here is the Onion Share. Onion Share is another one you can use over Tor. That's also fairly good about anonymity. Um, so there's some decent options, but not so much for the desktop itself. Let's look at operating systems really quickly. Mac OS, Windows, we know, collects data. They phone home. To an extent, actually, Ubuntu collected some telemetry, funny enough. I don't think it's as bad, and I think it can be disabled. Linux as a whole provides reasonable security, but it depends on what you download, right? So like, or what application you use. Like I'm using Discord for Linux. Well, I mean, that kind of defeats the purpose a little bit because it's getting information about my desktop. Not a ton, but enough. The other ones, Tyari uses cubes, which I think he mentioned in his last talk. Cubes is for isolated compartments. So essentially, you can isolate software to compartments that connect with each other or don't connect with each other. So it requires some skill to actually get that set up, and it requires decent hardware. But it's a good option if you're really concerned about your desktop privacy. Unix is another OS that operates as two VMs, and it exclusively uses Tor, like desktop-wide. So essentially, one is your workstation and one is your Tor gateway. So all of your traffic is going through this Tor gateway. Tails is meant to be run live on USB. So you actually boot from the USB, and essentially when you remove the USB, everything is wiped from your RAM, everything like that. It's a good option for old hardware because it can be run on relatively, older CPUs and things like that. Virtualization. You can actually virtualize a lot of these applications even mentioned before to prevent local data leaks. You can reduce your attack surface, by limiting where your malware, if you happen to download malware, it can't go very far. And you can enforce strict network rules. Both VirtualBox and VMware have decent networking rules that you can configure to prevent, any data leakage from there. And the last thing I'll mention, which is not very, again, very kind of thrown together, I didn't mention much about proxies. The free proxies are very suspect. Like you essentially you're passing your traffic through a random server somewhere out in the world, and that's it. That's all you're doing. It's not like a virtual private network because your traffic's not encrypted or anything. It's not tunneled, right? It's just sent to another server instead, and then that's proxied to the web. Or your requester proxies through a couple proxies, and maybe you have three proxies running. But essentially, the free proxies are, who knows who's actually running those proxies and what data they're collecting. Remember, if something's free, yeah, you're the product, right? So paid proxies are better, but again, payment may be tricky. Payment is tied to financial information, which is tied back to you. Um, and this is worth looking up if you're ever going to use proxies. Proxy trains is a tool, and you'll see it mostly in terminal. And you can use that to establish, if you happen to get proxies for your traffic, you can make it so that it randomizes when you connect to different proxies, or it dynamically changes the proxies so that if one fails, if one proxy is down, it uses the next proxy in line. So that's a pretty good tool to anonymize your traffic as well. Are there any questions in general chat? That's pretty much the end of it. I know there's a lot of information. I didn't go too much in detail. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions in voice chat. Or you say it out loud too. Oh, I actually, let me end the recording too. So